Thank you, Pat and panel. And now our keynote. Our keynote today is a conversation with Jon Landau. I'm delighted to introduce this. Academy Award and two-time Golden Globe winning producer Jon Landau holds the distinction of having produced the two highest-grossing movies of all time, Avatar and Titanic. His understanding of complex, state-of-the-art technologies and his ability to work with the highest caliber of creative talent have enabled him to play a significant role in numerous major motion pictures. Mr. Landau is working throughout the industry to push technologies to new levels that will allow new stories to be created and presented in more engaging, immersive ways. Interviewing Mr. Landau is David Cohen. David is a technology columnist and reporter for Variety. He has led the coverage of visual effects, post-production, 3D, and the digital revolution for more than a decade. He's also the author of 3 books, including screenplays, How 25 Scripts Made It to a Theater Near You. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Landau and Mr. Cohen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody.
Hi, everybody. I have my phone out here because we have invited questions by social media. It is not because I'm just checking my email. And if you are following this on the internet and you do want to tweet questions, my Twitter is variety_DSCohen. So John, those of us here in the room have seen Mr. Cameron's tutorial on high frame rate 3D. And first of all, he says pretty definitively when he gets to the 60 frame per second clips, this is the future of digital cinema. So does that mean that you're going to make Avatar 2 and 3 at 60 frames a second?
You know, I don't think we've determined yet what high frame rate we're going to use. I mean, the strong likelihood is that we will use a high frame rate. Why? Because we believe it's a better experience for the audience, that we're going to actually engage them more in our narrative storytelling. And that ultimately is our goal. Our view on the technology of high frame rates is that nobody should dictate to a filmmaker what frame rate they should make their films at. The technology exists today where a film can be shot at 24, 48, or 60 and still presented with the same equipment. And we think that's fundamentally very important. Everybody can pick and choose which format they want to use.
You know, we've had our first look now at high frame rate 3D with The Hobbit. And I want to get your reaction to The Hobbit, because I'll tell you that it was not universally liked. A lot of people had trouble with the look of it. And I wondered what your take was on how it was used and whether you were thinking that there were things that you would like to do differently.
Well, look, I think that we work in a creative medium. And I think that what Peter Jackson presented is what Peter Jackson wanted to present. And I don't think it means that that's what all high frame rate's going to look like. That was a choice that Peter made. I think you will see the footage that was shot earlier today looks and feels very different. That was Jim Cameron applying his sensibility, you know, to that footage. So I think that it's a creative tool, and filmmakers need to take the time to understand how to work with it. If you compare The Hobbit to the first 3 Lord of the Rings, they're very tonally different. And I think people went to The Hobbit expecting the tone to be the same as it was for the first 3 movies. And the tone of the movies themselves was not. And then when you add the high frame rate to that, which made everything else, high frame rate to me exacerbates everything. So if you're doing something that it might be a little bit more theatrical than people are expecting, it plays more theatrical in the high frame rate. But it doesn't mean it wasn't the filmmaker's creative choice. And if you look back at 3D, I mean, I think it's the same thing can be said if you looked at you know, a movie like Journey to the Center of the Earth and said, okay, that was the first movie that was really shot and came out in 3D. And the 3D sensibility in that, Eric did a great job applying it for that movie and was right for that. And in that moment in time, if you sat there and said, okay, boy, I just saw Journey to the Center of the Earth, I can see Marty Scorsese using this technology. You'd say no. But in fact, Marty Scorsese did when he did Hugo. And he applied his creative sensibility to 3D, and I think we'll see the same evolution with high frame rate.
Well, you mentioned that high frame rate exacerbates everything. I think that's kind of interesting. When I was a very young man, I worked with I did a season of Summer Stock where I worked with a producer who would be painting frantically on the sets. He would say, "I just see it under light, it'll look great." And you know, usually it did, because he was actually quite a good scene painter. But if you stood there on the stage and looked at the thing, it didn't always look that great, because he understood how the stage lights and the distance would change that. I think we're seeing some of that now with movies, that the more clarity, the more resolution, the closer we get to the experience as if you were standing there next to the camera, the more the other crafts have to evolve to look great when we actually see them on the screen.
And filmmakers have to continue to ask themselves, why are we doing something? Why are we utilizing high frame rate? Why are we utilizing 3D? Why are we utilizing digital technology? And apply that into the storytelling. Not every shot necessarily benefits. I'm not saying it distracts from a high frame rate, but I don't know that a person would be able to really ascertain the difference in a normal close-up between 24 frames and a higher frame rate. So maybe you implement different techniques as you make your movie and apply them differently for the different shots you're doing in the film, and just keep that in mind whenever you're applying technology. What is the goal of why you're using that technology?
Here's an Avatar question from Woody Schultz, who was one of your performance capture team on the first movie. He said, when do I suit up for Avatar 2 and 3?
It will be this century.
Well, we're confident of that.
No, but you're talking, technology means so much today. And what excites us about technology is the potential it gives storytellers. I really feel that, even 10 years ago, there were stories that could be conceived that could not be realized. But I believe that today the technology exists where if somebody can dream it, somebody can find a way to realize it. And I think what's important as we explore these things like we did with Avatar and performance capture and other things is not to lose sight of why people go to the movies, why people watch television. Nobody watches for the technology. People watch for the content. They watch because they make an emotional connection to a sporting event, to a television show on TV, to a drama in the theaters, to a comedy in the theaters. So how do we preserve those things and not let the technology get in the way? And when we started using performance capture, there was at the beginning an outcry from the acting community suggesting that what we were trying to do was get rid of the actors. And in fact, we were doing the reverse. We were trying to preserve the actors. We were trying to allow them to play characters that they could not otherwise play, where they are making the creative choices. And I think that's what we have to keep in mind as we move forward.
I think you'd get now the complaint that you're trying to eliminate animators.
No, again, everybody has their role. And if you look, one of the key people on our team and is a gentleman by the name of Richie Bainham, who was our animation director in-house, and we had Andy Jones. They worked hours tirelessly to make sure that the performances that were given came through. And not everything can be, performed. I've never had an actor yet who could actually wave their tail behind them like the avatars could. So the animators need to be involved.
So, no one has been more aggressive about pushing forward technology in cinema over the last 20 years than Jim Cameron, and you've been his close collaborator. You've relied enormously on advances in visual effects and pushed many of them forward. We now have a big story in the entertainment community about the crisis in the visual effects industry. We've had 2 of the major companies go bankrupt. There's a clear problem with that business being broken. Since you rely on it so much, you must have been paying attention to this. Do you have any thoughts on how this can be solved in a way that makes that business function so it serves Hollywood the way it needs to?
Well, number one, I think there has to be an acknowledgement on the broadest sense that there's a democratization of technology. No longer is technology reserved for the big major companies. Small companies can be utilizing the same technologies, and companies that have existed for years. I've used Rhythm and Hues for a number of years, and they've been fantastic. But they are a big, robust company, and as the technology evolved, and other companies could exist on a much smaller overhead with a much smaller footprint, these companies have to adapt and find a way to put themselves in a competitive marketplace where not only do they have the best people, because it's always about the people behind the technology, but they can deliver it at a price that is at least competitive with people on the outside. So I think it's about changing. I remember when we were doing Titanic, we had a situation where we needed more computing power. And we had to go out and buy on the show one computer at $750,000 to get our shots done. Now you're going out there, and on Avatar, we had 10,000 quad processing machines, and they barely cost, I think, as much as that one computer did on Titanic. So companies have to adapt to the technology that's out there and what I call this democratization, and find a way to work with the talent that is out there.
I have another question from social media from Caleb, whose Twitter handle is cpenny20 via Twitter. Do you believe Avatar could have been all that it was if it had been outsourced to China and or India?
I think if they had the same creative talent there, I don't know enough about the creative talent pool. I think the technology certainly exists, and I've recently been to both China and India, and I think they're definitely emerging markets. I think what we were able to do with Weta Digital and ILM, the two companies that did the majority of our effects, is we were able to work very collaboratively with them. And I think as we move forward, technology is going to create more and more of a collaborative workflow across international boundaries. And how do we work in that way? So if we're sitting there and someone is fluent in English and really understands the nuances of the conversations that we're having about a certain shot we're reviewing, I think it can work. And I look forward to working with this broader range of talents. One of the great things about the crews we've been fortunate enough to work with on Avatar is that they were an international crew. We had people from everywhere working on the visual effects. Now, they weren't all based elsewhere, but working with people who've come out of China or come out of Eastern Bloc European countries or South America, that's very exciting. Because the more people we can have working with these tools, the better it is for all of us. Let's
talk a little bit about sound. We had some presentations here yesterday on immersive sound, and we see these new sound formats coming out, Dolby Atmos, Barco's 11.1. First of all, one of the things that was a topic yesterday was, they always said sound and picture, it's 50-50 for the movie experience. Is it still 50-50? Is it shifting one direction or the other?
I think it's the total experience. I think
and that's a dodge.
It's not, because I think it goes back to what's more important on a football team, defense or offense. If they don't score, you can't lose. If you don't score, you can't win. So I think every movie, there's a different answer to that. But I think it's how filmmakers use these things in combination, and how theater owners present it. Because it doesn't matter what we do in delivering a product if the presentation quality is not there. What are the projector companies doing? What is the sound? What are the chairs that people are sitting in? What is that total experience? We need to do more today than we ever have to drive people out of their homes and into the theaters. Why? Because the in-home experience has gotten so much better. And that's very exciting too. That just should push us in the film industry to try and do more as a total experience on the package. We're putting in a theater that we're working on, at Lightstorm for the next 2 Avatars, and we put a stop in what we were doing as we saw the evolution of the sound systems, waiting for them to get there, and we're now putting in the latest sound system, so that's going to be part of our daily viewing experience at Lightstorm, because that is important. And I think it's a balance. And what's interesting, again, going back to high frame rate, going back even further to magnetic sound, and how do you use that as a filmmaker? How do you work with it? I remember when I first went to see movies when they had the 6-track sound for the first time in the theaters, and I found myself looking to the right, looking to the left, because everybody was overusing the sound and distracting you from the intent of the film. So how do you learn to use Atmos? How do you intend to use Oro? How do you intend to use these other things? We have to take the time to learn that.
I want to alert our audience here in the building that we are going to have 15 minutes for questions at the end of the session, so start getting your questions ready. Now, you mentioned that the home experience improving. We're at a sort of an odd moment in entertainment. The theater experience is still mostly either the legacy 35mm film or 2K, mostly delivered on hard drives. And starting this year, you're going to start to see ultra-high-def televisions on sale, and Sony and Netflix say they're going to have 4K streaming to the home. So you have a moment where the home experience at the high end is leapfrogging the mainstream movie experience. What do you think that cinema as an industry is going to have to do to leapfrog the 4K UHD experience?
I don't think the answer is technology. I think the answer is content, is what are you presenting? If you think about this, television for years has been ahead of film. They've been at a higher frame rate. Right there, we were talking, the last session was talking about the importance of frame rate and all these other things. So television's been home. People want to seek out the communal experience. We've done that as human nature since Greek tragedies years ago. We have to deliver content that warrants it. And if you look, I think that the more challenging thing is that 15 years ago, 20 years ago, films were at the cutting edge of pushing boundaries. Now it's television that is doing that from a story content standpoint. You see more provocative television than you do in the theaters. You see it on HBO, you see it on Showtime, the FX channel. All the content they are creating, it's much more risque, both in content and actually in visual, than film is allowing themselves to be. And I think that is a challenge for the film industry, to go out there and not be afraid to challenge the audiences to experience what they've become comfortable now experiencing in their homes back in the theaters.
Well, I'm going to throw a paradox at you here. I've argued that television has actually become, in some respects, a more communal experience. And it certainly was in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, when only a few networks and shows were just sort of on when they were on. And if you didn't see All in the Family or the Mary Tyler Moore Show or Hill Street Blues when it was on, you couldn't participate in the conversation at school or in the office the next morning.
Right.
So can movies compete with a medium that is both more provocative and in some ways more communal?
It's funny because my interpretation is that the television experience has actually gotten less communal because of the availability of the content. You no longer have to be there Friday night at 8 o'clock to watch the show you want to watch. You can watch it at any time. So in my household, my son will watch it at one time, my other son will watch it another time, and I might watch it another time. Well, I remember X number of years ago, I think it was the first season of 24, they'd wait for me, we'd come home from work, and we'd all watch 24 together. Now that doesn't have to happen because you can access it in so many different ways. So I think that's an interesting thing, but I don't think that's a bad thing for the film industry. I think that, again, the experience of going into a theater and having the room darkened, and you're not worrying about who's going to ring the front door, you're not worrying about the phone that's going to ring or the baby in the other room. I think that's why people go to the movies.
And yet there seems to be a generation that wants to text and have their phones on during the movie.
I even heard someone on one of your panels was texting during a panel. I think it's interesting. I think that is true, and I think the question is, it's a little bit like, I think George Lucas once said, continuity is for wimps. If somebody's noticing that there's a continuity issue, there's something that's not engaging them in the film. So I go back to let's engage the audiences more, where they forget about whatever devices they're holding.
Let's talk a little bit about the state of 3D today. This conference, for years, was very much devoted to 3D. There's still a lot of talk about 3D here, and yet some of the excitement has cooled. I see a lot of tweets and social media posts about 3D is dead. It doesn't look dead to me.
It doesn't look dead to me either. I think that 3D, when it came out, let's call that 3 years ago, the new 3D, digital 3D, it's evolutionary, it's not revolutionary. It takes time to evolve. If you look on an international market base, 3D is phenomenal, what 3D is able to do. And it's interesting, I have my own reasoning for this. If you look at an emerging market like China, where more theaters are rolling out on a weekly basis than we ever had here in North America. In Russia, where there's so many new markets that have never had theaters before. Those people in those communities, in rural communities who are going to the theater for the first time, they're experiencing films in 3D. That's now what they think of as that experience. They don't know anything different. So to show them a 2D presentation is a step back for them, because all they know is the 3D. Here in North America, we've grown up with 2D, and that's what we've known all our lives. And 3D became this unique thing for a certain number of movies. I think ultimately, I honestly believe everything's going to go to 3D in home and in theaters. I think it's only natural. We see more in 3D. We see our lives in 3D. We experience it. We make judgments based on how close we lean to something, how far we step away based on 3D. So I think that when it first happened, we had a limited number of screens that could play it. Those screen numbers were higher at the box office because only a limited number of screens that could play it. Now the proliferation of 3D capable screens is everywhere. So people look, oh look, the averages are down. The averages might be down, but the total number of people on a worldwide basis that are enjoying 3D is up. And as you look at the new technologies, as you look at laser projection, where it's only going to become better, and we look at high frame rate. The other thing I want to say about high frame rate does not just have an impact on 3D movies. I know Jim's presentation was really about 3D films, but high frame rate will also have a dramatic effect on 2D films. We have watched films for centuries, or more than a century, I should say, at the 24 frames, and we've become used to strobing, and we've become used to flicker. We've become used to those artifacts. But the high frame rate eliminates those for 2D as much as it does for 3D.
I wanted to ask you, as a producer, as someone who makes movies, for you, what is working in 3D production right now, and what still needs to be fixed?
I think what's working in 3D is when less is more. 3D for us has always been about a window into a world and not a world coming out of a window. And I think when I go to see a 3D film and I can forget about it being in 3D, I think that should be the goal of every 3D filmmaker. To let people go, forget it's in 3D, don't have a yo-yo coming off the screen where you're ducking out of the way. Why? You've just worked for however many minutes to earn a suspension of disbelief, and now you've interrupted that with this device coming out. So, I think that we're seeing more and more capabilities with 3D camera systems to make the filming easier. I think it's interesting to note that the last 3 movies to win Oscars for Best Cinematography were all 3D films.
I want to talk to you about this concept of suspension of disbelief since you brought it up. I want to circle back to something I mentioned earlier. I think that one of the problems that the industry is now beginning to bump into is that suspension of disbelief becomes harder and harder as the image on the screen becomes more and more realistic. More and more like being there. At some point, that guy in the superhero costume begins to look like an actor in a superhero costume on a set and not a superhero.
And I think that's a little bit how do you bring your audience into the journey you're taking them on? How do you use these tools? Going back to The Wizard of Oz, that started in black and white and went to color when you went to Oz. Do you start a movie, creative choices, that if you're doing something in 3D, do you start it with less 3D at the beginning and envelop the audience into your storytelling so they become accustomed to it? And having a consistent point of view on what you're presenting. I think that's one of the great things that Jim Cameron does. Jim never looks at a single frame of film without reminding himself of what is the context of it in the story of the film, and what is the goal of that, and what is the reality you're creating. We go to movies for escapism. And yes, we could make them look more real, but to me, when it is the more real, you have to create the intimacy almost of live theater. We go to see live theater, and it's all real to us up on the stage, but it still works. And I think we can do that on a filmic basis.
And I'll tell you, having worked in the theater, and you, as a stage director, yes, you have real people in front of real people, you have real tangible objects and all that, but all of your work as a director is then in refining how people experience those real objects, those real people, those real sets. So does that change the role of the director? Does it change the creative function of a movie director to something closer to a stage director?
I think it changes the creative choices, so probably yes. I think, again, addressing, I know that when we were shooting Avatar, there were scenes where Jim would put smoke and diffusion into the backdrop of sets that if we weren't shooting 3D and we weren't shooting HD, he probably would not have done. But he did, and he made those creative choices. So I think it's going back and understanding the format you're working in, understanding the format it's going to be presented in, and making the adjustments so that the audience disappears into your world too.
You know, you mentioned putting diffusion in the background. One of the complaints about The Hobbit at 48 frame 3D was the complete sort of crispness and clarity of every part of the image. And my take on that was that I think it was a deliberate choice that he wanted to let your eye be able to wander around in that world and take it all in. But some people found it too much.
But again, I think you hit it right on the head. It was his creative choice. Peter did what he wanted to do with that. And I applaud him for doing that. You can only ask a filmmaker to put themselves into it. And I go back to Marty Scorsese. You know, when Marty Scorsese, you know, did Hugo, he put the amount of 3D into that film that he wanted to from his storytelling. And when The Dog's Face did what The Dog's Face did, that was his creative choice. But he was doing what he wanted. And Marty will tell you that working in 3D enhanced for him what the audience got out of the film. What Ang Lee did with Life of Pi in 3D and how he utilized that. And Ang is someone, again, who had not worked in 3D before. He had to learn the vocabulary of the film relative to 3D.
Do you have a wish list for this room, for this group of technologists, for what you would like to see them do to take what you're doing to the next level?
You know, I think, you know, going back to even the last presentation, you know, faster, brighter, more pixels, you know, those are the things that we would really like, you know, from end to end. You know, from the capture process to the workflow process. You know, workflow is a major issue now. When you deal in digital, you have so much content that you have to put through these pipelines, especially when I talk about collaborative workspaces across continents, across, you know, ocean divides. How do we push that through, and how do we push it through securely? You know, those are maybe two different things, and how do we do that, and how do we, you know, again, make it more accessible to people, the technology.
Here's a question by Twitter from Todd Margolis. How could performance capture enhance telepresence as we transition toward real-time, high-quality digital broadcasting? Do you have one on that?
Well, look, I think what we're trying to do, you know, more and more with our performance capture is we're trying to work in real time. We're trying to do it, and thanks to working with companies like Autodesk, you know, what we were able to do in our real-time capabilities now is light years ahead of what we were able to do, you know, back when we did the first Avatar. So then I don't know enough about the live broadcast world to really address that, other than to say that I think the tools will be available so that the people who do work in that format will be able to choose if it's appropriate or not.
You did 3D conversion on Titanic, and we heard from Barry Sandra yesterday about how much the price of 3D conversion has come down. Do you feel that the quality has come up and the price has come down to the point where you feel it is a comparable choice to shooting native 3D?
Number one, it will never be a comparable choice. I mean, it just won't. That's not to say there's not a market for conversion. But to quote Jim Cameron, if you want a movie in color, you're not going to shoot it in black and white. And the same thing goes, if you want a movie in 3D, shoot it in 3D. I don't understand the thinking behind saying to a director that, okay, you're going to be working on visual effects, you're going to be working on the sound finishing of the movie, you're going to be working on re-editing your movie, and at the same time, by the way, you need to spend your time making the creative choices that go into 3D because you're converting it. And when you do convert it, as good as a conversion can get, it's 2 3/4 3D. It's never going to be true 3D. The cost, when I look at it, no matter how much it comes down, it's still more expensive than if you were to shoot it. If you just look, let's just take a straight live show. If you're filming a show 2D versus 3D, you don't pay more for your stars, because it's in 3D. You don't pay more for your director. You don't pay more for your sets. You don't pay more for your production staff. You have a cost really in what I call two areas. One is the camera department, and one is in finishing costs. When we did Avatar, we edited the movie in 2D. We made the same decisions, so it wasn't a change to our post-production workflow, it was just the finishing workflow. That added cost to the camera department and finishing cost pales in comparison to the even lower cost conversion rates, let alone the time it takes away from the process of finishing your film properly. Now, having said that, our experience working with Stereo D was great. You know, they were really terrific to work with. From what I understand, the process was less expensive when they worked on Jurassic Park and was able to reduce their cost for Jurassic Park based on their experience. So the costs are going to come down. But let the filmmakers make the choices in the moment of shooting 3D.
Have you or any of your production staff ever had your eyes checked or calibrated for stereopsis? This was a topic that came up yesterday, that people do not always have a even balance between their eyes, that a lot of people no two people necessarily see 3D the same way.
Where are you, David?
Yeah.
Oh, there you. No, I don't think any of us have ever had that checked.
I have not either. I'm thinking that I probably should.
No, we've asked if we've had our minds checked for doing what we do, but never our eyes checked.
I'm going to play devil's advocate on this issue of conversion now, because and I do understand now why people are passionate about preferring it, because Jim has said himself, I believe, that in a movie you have to be able to cut from any shot to any other shot, and if you're shooting native, that constrains your choices on interaxial and convergence.
No, it doesn't.
Well, okay, well, please explain that.
Because you can sit there and as a post-process, you can post-converge your shots.
Well, okay, go on.
So you can sit there and you can look, from my point of view, and I'm not speaking for Jim here, to me, you know, the idea of always converging on the subject of focus, which then plays at the relative screen plane, allows you to cut as often as you want without getting eye strain, because the audience's eyes are in the theater and they too are always converging at the screen plane. And if you're doing that, you can cut as fast as you want, the shots can be as short as you want, and if you have a shot where you're not converged there, you can take the two images, adjust them slightly, and converge so that it's a post-fix in that process.
Jim did an interview with me a few years ago for NAB when the digital 3D was just rolling out, and he was very adamant that you can't really change the convergence in post at that time.
No, you can't really change the interocular in post. So the interocular is the distance between the two eyes. That's established when you capture. The convergence, you can absolutely adjust. And so I think that he might have misunderstood the question, but we did a number of post-convergences on Avatar, and Jim has done them on his documentary films and the like.
And if you're going to always converge at the point of focus, then you're limiting your choices as the director. Because again, you have to do that on every shot if that's going to be the way you're going to shoot the movie, and that's how you're going to solve this problem of
but you sit there, and again, it goes back to the choices, learning how to work with the tools. If I have a shot where I'm shooting the Grand Canyon and I want this wide vista, what's my subject of focus there? That might be an opportunity where I want the audience to let their eyes roam. And I might go with a little wider interocular because it's a wide shot, and I might set my convergence somewhere in the middle of the canyon where the audience doesn't notice that. There might be another moment, like Marty Scorsese chose to do, where the Doberman Pinscher, that's in front of the screen. That was a creative choice he made. So again, rules are made to be broken, and nothing is an absolute. I think that you work as a standard, and then you adjust it around it.
Let's shift gears a little bit. Again, we've got a room full of people who are making the tools that you want to use. We know that whatever comes out of this room, Jim is going to be one of the first people to take it apart, put it back together, do something with it. What are you excited about that you see coming down the pike? Expanded color gamut? Are you excited about higher frame rates? Are you excited about holographic television? What gets you excited?
What gets me excited is the idea of audio stereoscopic screens where people won't need to wear glasses to watch 3D in their homes, and ultimately those screens will get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and hopefully into theaters someday. What gets me excited is a higher dynamic range. Being able to play, more, be able to present Pandora in a higher dynamic range would be very exciting. The high frame rates, again, we think is something that will not only be for film, but ultimately for television. I think I could see broadcast television going to 60 frames per second, in the future, and broadcasting the World Cup to the world at 60 frames per second in 3D into people's homes, so people don't have to travel to go see the World Cup. So,
I think there are already some TV sports casts that are at 60 frames, but I think they're at 60 frames interlaced and not progressive.
Right. I think ultimately that will go to the progressive, though.
I've got another question here, and this is from Bob Schooley via Twitter, and I don't know all the details on this, so I will throw this to you. Does Disney's Lucasfilm deal have any impact on the theme park Avatar project?
No, it does not. We're one of the big thrills, I think, for both Jim and I is, here we go, we make this little movie we call Avatar, and now Disney wants to make a whole land around the park. And that is very exciting for us. The first park their brilliant Imagineering team is working on is for Orlando, and it is moving ahead full steam, and we are thrilled.
And from Tim Sassoon via Facebook. Tim's a very skilled 3D conversion guy. He wants to know, will the tentpole only strategy come to an end, and what will replace it?
Well, is he talking about just for 3D or just
No, in general.
I don't think it is the tentpole only strategy. I mean, I go back and you look at
there are found footage movies. I mean, but it's sort of become tentpoles, and then low budget horror films and comedies.
Is Life of Pi a tentpole?
That's a good question.
Is Argo a tentpole? Is you can name so many movies. We're not a tentpole industry. There are tentpoles that support the industry, and you need that to keep the tent up. But there's a lot of other content that is very exciting for the consumer to go see. So I don't view us, I think maybe 15, 20 years ago, we were more in a tentpole where studios were out there and that's all they were really looking to do. But I see studios now doing a much wider variety, of films that are very exciting to see.
I'm going to put you on the spot here about Avatar 2 and 3. First, I am sure that I read or was told that part of what was going on Jim's dives in the Pacific was testing underwater cameras for future production use. Is that for Avatar 2 and 3, and why would you be shooting underwater?
That's what you read. No, I read the same article and I was wondering the same question.
All right.
I think people got confused. I mean, Jim has certainly talked about part of Avatars 2 and 3 taking place underwater. What Jim did in going to the Challenger Deep had nothing to do with Avatar. Jim, I have always said that Jim is an explorer. He explores in his movies, he explores in his life. And he saw an opportunity to go to a place that only 2 men had ever gone to before. And he went out and he led a team of engineers and designed a submersible to go to the Challenger Deep. Yes, they filmed, but it had nothing to do with Avatar.
Okay, so what can we expect to see in Avatar 2 and 3?
That's right. No, look, I mean, I think, what we want to do is we want to take advantage of the technologies brilliant people are putting out there for us to utilize to make the next 2 movies even more emotionally engaging, even more visually tantalizing, and to really wrap up the story arc of our 2 main characters.
Okay, so
Thank you.
But we are going to be going underwater. So how do you do underwater performance capture?
So how do we do performance? That's one of the, we've had a team of people on we've kept a number of our digital artists on since the last Avatar. We did something I think that was relatively unprecedented when we finished the first Avatar. We did, and I call it a post-mortem. Jim says I can't call it a post-mortem because nobody died. But we did a retreat where we took our key department heads and we went away for 2.5 days and we talked about what did we do right, what did we do wrong, how do we do it better and differently in the future. And Jim would say that when we were doing the first Avatar, we're breaking new ground, he would say, because we're screwing up so much. So how do we screw up less moving forward, knowing the things we want to do? So how do we capture people underwater? That's one of the things that we have been looking at. We do want to do performance capture underwater. How do we do that? And those are the exact type of things we're working on right now.
Well, do you actually need, if you're going to do performance capture, do you actually need to be underwater, or is there a way to simulate the buoyancy of water without having to be in a tank?
What I would say, because our goal is to preserve the performance and to have the actors give as real life a performance as possible, we want them in water. Because we could simulate it visually, but we can't simulate it experientially for them. So I think that's the difference. I will tell you, there's a scene in Avatar where Jake, Sam Worthington, jumps in, is going down the raging waters, and we weren't equipped to film that anyway. So we found an office chair on wheels, put him on the wheels, had somebody push him, and he just swam while the chair was going down. It worked for that short and brief a moment, but won't work in the long run.
So we will not be seeing people suspended on wires and trying to pretend they're underwater to do performance capture. You're gonna do performance capture in a tank.
We will do performance capture in water.
Can the Na'vi breathe water?
Is that a statement or a question?
No, it's a question. What do Na'vi use for scuba gear, or don't they need it?
If I told you that, you wouldn't buy a ticket to go see the movie.
Come on. All right, we're going to go to questions here in just a moment, but I want to ask Jon one more thing.
About Avatar?
Am I forbidden? Are these technical advances now a hard sell at the studio? I mean, given that your last few movies have made $1 billion each, I imagine nothing you say to them is a hard sell at Fox. But when you go
everything's a hard sell. Look, Avatar was a hard sell. And you wouldn't think on the surface, in retrospect, looking back at it, saying, oh, well, Jim Cameron, and, he'd done Titanic and Terminator and all and he's returning to what he did with Terminator. And that was a really hard sell. They were saying, they're going, is anybody go see a movie with blue people that have tails? It's not about the technology, it's about the story. And with technology comes a cost impact and a cost implication. And the studios are afraid of the unknown. It's much easier for a studio to make a decision where they could justify to their bosses, here's why we're doing it and here's the simplicity of it. So, hopefully they understand the technology is a little bit better going forward and it won't be as hard a process of getting a green light, but we'll have to go through it again.
All right, we do have a line for questions, so let's get started here. We'll start on this side and we'll alternate sides. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I've got a two-part question. You started out in the music business.
Wrong Jon Landau.
Oh, the wrong Jon Landau. Okay, that corrects.
We get that confused all the time, and I still have not been able to get one single Bruce Springsteen ticket out of it. I'm trying.
Okay, that's interesting. Well, the question then I have is, discuss your role as a producer, particularly for James Cameron. You produced Honey, I Shrunk the Kids and so on. How does working as a producer with James Cameron differ, or if it does differ, from being a producer with other auteurs or other directors that you've worked with?
Well,
what demands does he put on you that other
right.
producers? Okay.
I think working with Jim for everybody is more challenging than working with other directors, because Jim expects more out of you, but he expects more out of himself. I think the role of a producer is sort of that of a CEO of a company. And every movie is a startup company. And other companies might go out and hire engineers. We hire production designers. But it's the job as a producer to oversee that and never lose sight of the goal at the end. I think that's where people make a mistake. Nobody sets out to make a bad movie. We've all gone to see bad movies. So a producer's role is to what did we identify as our goal, and how do I, as this person overseeing the process, make sure that people who are much smarter than I am doing their jobs can do it? Because we stand on the shoulders of all the great people who work with us on the shows. So it ranges from script to casting to production to marketing, to all those things. As it relates to Jim, I think there are times when I need to be both the angel on the shoulder and the devil on the shoulder. And it's finding that balance, and also finding a team of people who are not afraid to voice their creative point of views with Jim. Because I can't be the only one who's hollering in his ear. We need a team of people around us who will contribute that, because filmmaking is a collaborative effort, and Jim's the first one who will recognize that.
I just wanted to follow up quickly.
We have a long line for questions, so I think we're not going to have time for follow-ups. So we'll go to this side, please.
As it relates to collaborative workflows across international boundaries, have you experienced any working problems that you might or could attribute to the lack of cross-cultural understanding?
We have not yet. Our workflow is really based on, working with, we worked New Zealand, Canada, and England are sort of the three international places that we really worked with, on Avatar remotely in terms of a cross collaboration. And I think we have similar enough, societal, workspaces that it wasn't an issue for us, but I could see it being one down the future. I always also think, even for those type of workspaces, it's very important for people like myself to go and visit and make an in-person contact before we start that collaborative workflow. I think that's very important. I think people lose sight of how important that is. And then to follow it up as you're in the process. Don't do it. Maybe Jim can't travel because he's got so many other things to do, but for me to make another trip to Weta, to me to go to England to visit another company we're working there, for me to go up to ILM and work with them, I think you want to keep that personal touch going.
Thank you.
Okay, over here.
Bill Beck from Laser Light Engines. Now that we're starting to see big screen 3D at 14-foot Lamberts enabled by laser, what would you anticipate some of the challenges in filmmaking, and what constraints does low light level put on your storytelling?
Well, I think it's interesting. As a filmmaker, and we dealt with this on Avatar, we went out, I want to say we had more different release prints than any other film, because we wanted to take into account what the audience was getting in the theater. What was their presentation in the theater? And we did a different color timing pass for IMAX film, IMAX 3D, IMAX digital, for higher light levels, for the XL system from Real D, for lower light levels, all these different things. So I think the laser is, until it proliferates everywhere, until there could be one standard of what we know the full gamma range is, what the light levels are, us as filmmakers, we're going to really need to pay attention to what are we delivering as the content. And when people talk about, oh, I went to see a movie in 3D and it looked dark, well, how much time did the filmmaker spend in understanding that it's going to be out at a 3.5-foot Lambert in that theater and adjusting their master accordingly? So I think it's, again, learning how to use that and dealing with it as a separate issue.
We also know, we know we have a problem where it's been timed for 3.5, it's being shown at 2.5 or 2.
That's right. But look, I remember years ago on a release of a movie, opening day, I went into a theater, opening day, and there's a scratch through one whole reel of the film. So we could only control so much.
Okay, over on this side.
Mr. Landau, thanks for coming. It's been a really great conversation. I think everyone's really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
You touched on something earlier that I thought was interesting. You said that Rhythm and Hues and other visual effects companies need to be more competitive, and I think one of the ways that they've been competitive recently is having their workers work 6 and 7 days a week, sometimes without overtime, and definitely not with benefits. So how do we maintain a healthy work environment for these creative artists while allowing these companies to remain profitable? Do you have any thoughts on that? I know you don't work for those companies, but what would you recommend?
You know, look, I think number one, you have to always value your worker. And you have to value the time they spend. And when you ask them to do something that is above and beyond, you have to compensate for them for spending that time. I think the question becomes, how do we create more efficiencies? How do we create lower overhead? How do we streamline things? It might not be additional jobs. It might be a reduction of jobs to stay competitive, which is not something a workforce wants to hear, but that might be the reality of it. So I think there are other ways to do it without taking advantage of people you're working with. I also think, what has happened today is visual effects companies are forced to put a tremendous amount of effort into bidding movies. And that is a big burden for them. And they invest in the time to bid these movies, and sometimes they don't get these movies. And that puts them in a really difficult position because they've already sort of staffed up, because if they get the bid, the movie wants to go right away. But what happens when they don't get the bid? I think we have to be a little bit more flexible in how we deal with those type of situations.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Joe DiGennaro. I'm a cinematographer. You spoke a lot about the advances you want to see, higher frame rate, more dynamic range. You talked about workflow and about the data volume that you've got to move across continents. I'm curious to know, in the first Avatar, what are you thinking about in terms of preserving it toward the future? 100 years from now, you still want audiences to appreciate Avatar. Are you saving, how are you approaching archive and future content? And I'm curious to know whether you saved only your finished product in that archive, or have you tried to preserve the elements of what it took to make the movie and save those for the future historical value?
I think you touched on a huge global issue, which we were talking about earlier, which is the preservation of all of the digital content that is now flowing, not just out of Hollywood, but out of around the world. What is important in the moment that happens to be captured on film might not realize the significance, and I'm now talking about in the news media. You might not realize the significance of something that was captured on film that has a great importance later on. How do we preserve all of that? I think we as an industry need to figure that out. We have all dealt with computer drives where we thought we were backed up, and we go to use the data and it's gone. Yeah. So I think that is a real issue. And I wish I could tell you that we had an answer that we feel comfortable with. I don't know, that we do. I think, long-term preservation for films, still in many ways the safest thing, but if there's going to be the film stock and the way to use it, is going to the YCM still and protecting yourself that way. In the meantime, I think it's almost somebody's full-time job to stay current on the evolution of digital storage technology and taking the content and preserving it. Our goal would be to preserve everything we have on Avatar, and not just the finished product, the behind the scenes, the interviews, the outtakes, all of that stuff, just for preservation purposes. But I think we have to stay on it and be very mindful of what we're doing. It's really interesting, on the next Avatar, our machine room looks like a NASA machine room, where everything is being stored, and we're working with EMC to build that situation out so that we're storing and we're backing up and we're protecting as much as we can, and also keeping it on 2 different continents so that we're not just storing stuff here in North America, but also elsewhere to protect ourselves.
Thank you.
Over here?
Yes, Howard Luck, Walt Disney Studios. We all have to deliver 2D movies and 3D movies at the same time. And I think if I heard you correctly, you kind of did a 2D cut on Avatar. And then, do you feel like you're compromising one or the other when you do that? Or would you do the next Avatar as cutting it as a 3D movie and then deliver a 2D movie? Or?
No, I don't think we're compromising at all. That's not to say whether technology will allow us to edit in 3D. I don't know that an editor is going to want to work at an Avid for 12 hours a day watching 3D. We found that the creative choices are no different. And I don't think they really should be. I think that you have in your mind you know, what is the intent of any given shot and why do I want to cut on a moment? You know, cutting actually, you know, cutting patterns have an impact on how you shoot something in some ways. You know, one of the things that we feel is that if you're going into a sequence that is a faster cutting sequence, you can actually acquire that with less 3D, less of an interocular. Because in those moments of the fast cutting, it's not about the 3D. So you reduce the interocular there. So we find the changes in how we capture something and not really in how we edit something.
So I just want to be clear on this. You're saying that you don't feel that 3D requires any change in film grammar, in the grammar of edit or anything like that?
Correct.
Okay.
Chris Chinnock for Inside Media. John, you've talked about 3D being a creative tool and in the hands of great directors becomes a new way for telling a story, which we've seen so far. We've also talked at this conference a lot about new audio systems, but we talked a lot about the technicality of that, how you mix it, how you distribute it. I wanted to ask you about the creative aspects of that. Are there going to be ways that we can now bring the capabilities of object-based capture to the movie creation process? What does that mean from a creative point of view?
I think that's very exciting. You know, I think that the more we're able to do that, and again, create that experience for the audience, again, but to use it in the service of the story.
Yeah.
And I think that's the concern that people have to balance out. That's why I go back to, it's not just about the visual, it's not just about the audio, it's not just about the seats, it's about that whole experience. And where do we use, you know, object-based sound to really engage the audience more? That's something that we want to try and do as we move forward, and I think it's very exciting.
Could we see that in Avatar?
You could. You might not, but you could.
You're great at this dodging, aren't you? Thank you.
All right, next up.
Radoslav Markov, you say that the content is the king. People come to cinema for the content, but the content cannot exist without the technology. It's been their merit in the way that nobody dominates, and they should reciprocally respect each other. Did you think that content without technology is impossible, but technology itself can exist? Because in the beginning of cinema, 10 years, it was technology only.
Well, I mean, if I think I understand the question, my answer will be, I don't think technology can exist without the content. I think that, you know, because there's so many other avenues now where people can get something, both visually and emotionally, with very little content. And I think the web has proven that. People can go out and produce things on the web, you know, with very low-end technology, but very high-end results, and have the ability to reach millions and millions of people. I mean, it's really phenomenal. So I think it's really combining the two, and I do think that, you know, story comes first. And if you have a great story, but you have very little technology to apply to it, that people will still come because you have a great story.
Over here.
Hi, Jim Houston. You had mentioned at least one area of technology you were looking at in terms of the motion capture. I remember in the original Avatar development that Mr. Cameron waited a very long time to start working on the movie because he didn't feel he had the tools yet. And I'm wondering today, besides the 60 frame rate that was mentioned earlier, are there other areas of technology that still are lacking key elements or things that, as a filmmaker, he would like to see developed?
There is nothing that we are waiting for from a technological standpoint. We feel that there are some things that are on the near horizon that we can be the impetus to drive forward. We work in virtual production on Avatar. So when I say that, we have a stage. We don't have theatrical lighting. We have digital lighting. And I talk about lighting because lighting is one of the things that we really lacked in the first film when we were doing our performance capture. We were limited to what Motion Builder had as a limit of 6 lights in their suite that we could actually drive at 24 frames per second. We've been working with Autodesk, we've been working with Weta Digital to create a lighting package, a tool set, that when we're on the virtual production stage, that we can light the same way that we would light a set, and ultimately the same way Weta would realize those shots. So not only will we be working at a higher fidelity object on the set, but it will streamline our process in working with Weta Digital and make their back end more efficient. So that's the type of things we're looking at.
We're almost out of time. We got time for one more quick question.
Okay, thank you for creating such a magical world in Pandora. And I'm just wondering, how involved do you get with the fan base, like the Facebook fan page, where there's so much interactivity with people's excitement over what you've created? And do you consider, you know, the ideas that your fan base has when you're creating the new versions?
You know, too, I like to get as involved as possible. Last year I went up, there was a little fan convention up at the museum up in Seattle where there was an Avatar exhibit. I went up for the day there, spent it, and I saw more Avatar tattoos on people's bodies than I could possibly imagine. One gentleman had his whole body with Avatar stripes on it and has his car all done in Avatar. But I love that interaction. I love doing that, and we do keep in touch. We have a woman by the name of Kathy Franklin, who's heading up our franchise development, and she stays much more in touch with them than I do. I think there's a difference between hearing what their ideas are and using those ideas, and hearing what their wants and desires are and trying to fill those. So I think we would focus more on the latter and trying to say, you know, how do we deliver really what our fan base wants? And that's been one of the really exciting things about working with Disney, that's been their goal as well. And I think, you know, with Avatar, we also have another unique opportunity. Avatar is a movie that has metaphors that relate to our world. And I think as we move forward in the world of Pandora, we have a responsibility to continue to bring those same things to people's light, not to do it in a way that preaches, but to do it in a way that is provocative. And if you look at the first film, the film opens and closes with the same image. Jake opening his eyes. So if we can in some way challenge people to open their eyes, I think we will all have done a little bit of good.
Well, Jon, we look forward to hearing that, seeing the movie in this century, as you said.
Great.
Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, everybody.
All for coming.
Thank you.
Wow, wasn't that terrific? Let's have another round. Okay, I have one last announcement to make. First off, we're breaking for lunch, and we'll resume at 2 p.m. This room is going to go dark, as we're going to be doing some testing on the laser projector. So as you vacate, please vacate as rapidly as you can, do so safely. And I'll see you all at 2.